Hello, podcast listeners. We know podcasts are a great way to catch up on a program that you may have missed on KSJE, and it's provided as a free service of this radio station. But KSJE is now listener supported, and so while you enjoy this podcast, we hope that you'll also take some time to join KSJE. Become a member today. It's quite easy to do. Just go to our website at ksje.com/support and pick the level of support that best matches your budget. Thanks again for listening. Here's your podcast.
Welcome back to Right on Four Corners. I'm DelSheree Gladden. I'm a USA Today bestselling author with over 30 published novels. And on this week's show, we have Orlando Davidson, and he's going to be here talking about his debut novel, Baseline Road. Orlando, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be with you. Baseline Road comes from a random thought I had during my professional career in Hawaii, which lasted for 35 years. I wasn't writing, but every once in a while I had this notion, namely, what if a radical bombing after Kent State at the Claremont colleges in 1970, in fact, was something far more complex than your typical radical bombing, because there were radical bombings back then. And that's about it. When I retired to North Carolina in 2012, I started to write. It was wonderful to have the opportunity to be able to do it with time. And I just wrote about all kinds of things and even produced a shelved novel, which I now consider a writing exercise, a 3-year writing exercise. Got hooked in with the Great Smokies writing program in Asheville, North Carolina, which is just a wonderful group of people. Couldn't have done it without them. So about 2017 or so, I decided to concentrate on what I really knew how to do, which was crime novels, because that's what I read all the time. And the result is Baseline Road, and I'm very happy in conclusion to this first part that Jeff at Artemisia Publishing managed to find me. Very grateful for that. So thank you.
That's great. And yeah, Artemisia Press is a local press here in New Mexico, which is how I got connected with you for the show. Because normally our authors either live in the Four Corners or their book is set in or about the Four Corners. And Baseline Road is actually set in California during the 70s. And you're living now in Portland, right?
Yeah, and also, ironically, even though I spent a lot of time in California, it was written in the South. So it's because I was in Glen Alpin, North Carolina when I wrote it. So written in the South about Southern California, but definitely not in the Southwest. So thank you for having me anyway.
Yeah, well, I have to say, I really enjoyed reading Baseline Road. I love mysteries, crime, especially true crime, which this isn't a true crime story, but actual events, it seems like, kept your mind on that topic and in a way inspired, like you said, what if similar events were something quite a bit different than what was happening at the time, but looked similar. So I wanted to ask you a little bit more about where this idea came from and how you developed it from that spark of a random thought, what if?
Well, I think that the way it really came about was, again, when I wrote this first novel that I put in a shelf, a proverbial shelf in this day and age, I'd had a workshop with it, several, and a woman who later became a good friend of mine was in the workshop. And my particular pages that evening were a shootout at the Rose Bowl. And she looked at me, which she wasn't really supposed to do in the workshop, and said, "Stop, you just wrote it. Stop right there." And what I later discovered and understood better was she was essentially saying, you know how to write crime fiction, and you know how to write it really well, so stick with it. So again, sometime in that period, 2017, 2018, I read a book about the Patricia Hearst kidnapping. I read another book about the Weather Underground. And essentially, bombs were very much part of the political currency in the late 60s, early 70s. often set off to not hurt anybody, but to make statements. Empty bathrooms, you name it. And that's when I decided that I was going to write it. I was going to flesh out the premise, I was going to create the characters, and take it from there.
And that is something that I really enjoyed about this, was that it had a very realistic feel to it. And I had to stop several times and be like, these weren't real events, right?
Yeah, I put that in the acknowledgments because there definitely were not radical bombs set off at the Claremont colleges in May of 1970. There had been a fairly serious bombing in 1969, so it wasn't out of the realm of possibility.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing, of course, is I was there, and I was swept up to some degree in the radical movement at that time, so I was able to write about it from a kind of a reporter's perspective, I guess, that again, even though it's fictional, it certainly could have happened. And that again, guided me very helpfully in my writing.
And like you said, you went to the Claremont colleges at the time. You spent some time there. You experienced a lot of the unrest and the political environment of that time. And I was going to ask you about your research into the time period, and after looking at your bio and your history and realizing you did actually live through a lot of that, how much did you have to go back and revisit, research certain elements to set the scene for this story?
Well, I went back to Claremont, probably, again, 2017, maybe 2018, and used the special collections at Honnold Library, which is the main library of the Claremont colleges. And for any of your listeners who don't know, the Claremont colleges consist of, I think it's 5 colleges. It's built on the sort of Oxford model of different schools, but then you pool a lot of collective resources. And it's a wonderful place. But anyway, Honnold Library is the main library. I used their special collections of that time period to make sure I wasn't going down the rabbit hole too much. And it confirmed pretty much what I remembered. The other thing it showed, which is amazing, is that college newspapers back then were really good. The editor of the Pomona College paper at that time went on to a long career at the New York Times. So I don't even know if they have, yeah, I guess they have college newspapers now, but certainly not of the quality and scale that they did back then. So I was able to read about that whole period. But I do have a real good memory, and I was able to mostly exploit my memory. And then in the editing process, if I got a drive-in wrong or a restaurant wrong or something like that, I was able to fix all of that as the editing process went on.
And how was that, working with an editor, and this being a time period that you lived through, that possibly your editor did not? I imagine there was a little bit of back and forth there, because with anything historical, it's so important to get the details correct. So how did that process go, working with an editor on this?
Well, I worked with several. I mean, if there's anything I learned as an older first-time novelist, it takes a village. The workshops were fabulous at Great Smokies. I then worked with some other people, a couple of editors that I hired. And they mostly took my facts as pretty much of a given. They were able to work on all kinds of other things that needed work. And at one point I got stuck halfway through, and a good friend of mine came up with a suggestion which got me past getting stuck. But there was never a conflict with any of the editors, and then including Jeff at Artemisia, with the sort of the factual context, because I knew it.
Well, that's great. I'm jealous that you have such a great memory. That's something I struggle with. Now, I wanted to ask you as well, when you're starting out with a new project, trying to figure out what perspective to write from can sometimes be a challenge.
Wonderful question.
So you went with multiple perspectives, and one of those being the main antagonist, the hitman.
Right.
How did you decide what perspectives to write from, and then how did you approach writing those?
Well, I knew that I wanted first person with Jimmy Soames, my primary detective protagonist. You know, I've just read so many first-person thrillers, detective fiction, etc., especially the Southern California version. And so I was going to do Jimmy first person. But then as I developed the Hitman, and he became lots of, I don't know if fun's the right word, but he became more complex and more interesting to me. And I definitely needed to set him apart from anything else. So third person was the way to do that, at least in my opinion, that set him up differently. Don't have him in first person, because I think that could have been confusing.
Yeah, I think that worked really well, going with third person with him. It did set it off for the reader as I was reading it, and that shift really seemed to work well, and it kind of caught my attention and made me pay attention the first time I encountered him in his perspective.
Yeah, it took a while. At least, well, of course, the first chapter is different, but I don't want to give too much away, although there it is right away. But in any case, I forget where Collins first appears, then later. He's in Las Vegas, and yeah, it's definitely a different perspective.
And I thought you did a really nice job with creating an individual tone and voice between Jimmy and the killer. And what was your process on that? Because that is something that a lot of newer writers struggle with quite a bit.
I understand your question. Again, that first book that I shelved, I ended up thinking that too many people sounded the same. And I think that Jimmy just felt personal to me. It's not that never was a 35-year-old cop in San Bernardino County, but I was able to write him and kind of feel him as I went. Collins, in some ways, I read a lot of the books by a fellow named Thomas Perry, and he has a big thing on TV right now called The Old Man with Jeff Bridges. I thought the book was way better. But he's real good at villains, and I needed to create a sort of a complex villain who was real good at his work, as were the police on the other side of this. So I was able, I think, to separate him, in my mind at least, very much from the good guys, if you will. And to me, maybe the biggest surprise was Carol, the other protagonist, because she sort of sprang to life to give Jimmy much more context, because in first person, as you know, that's it. I mean, you're driving down that road with one voice, but giving Jimmy his wonderful friend Carol allowed them in dialogue to do all kinds of other things. And I was real happy about how Carol turned out.
I thought that they played really well off of each other. They had distinct personalities that easily could conflict quite a bit, but they meshed really well despite their differences. And I enjoyed their play back and forth, whether serious or not so serious in some of the parts. They had a very fun relationship, and I feel like it added some lightness at times when things were very serious and at times a little bit darker.
Yes, I appreciated their banter. At some point, I'm going to go back and read the Dashiell Hammett Thin Man books, which involved, I think it was a husband and wife detective team that bantered a lot. I've seen little bits of the old movies, but anyway, I never did, so these are strictly sort of how I did it.
Well, I think it went really well. I enjoyed the characters a lot throughout this book, and relating to that, a lot of the characters, they all have different viewpoints on what's happening in this time period. Politically, looking from the police perspective and their view of things, to some of the students, to just some of the outside characters involved in the story. How did you balance a lot of conflicting viewpoints that, a lot of people even today still have really strong opinions on, without it getting, too preachy or leaning too far one way or the other? I felt like you kept a really good balance of everything. And I wanted to ask you how you went about that. What was your approach for dealing with a lot of difficult topics?
Well, thank you, first of all, for saying that. One of the things that was very important to me with the character of Jimmy Soames was that he have access to the counterculture, because he's essentially a fairly conservative person, but the fact that he was in a country rock band meant that he spent a lot of time, whether he liked it or not, with people that he might not agree with. And to me, it gave him an opportunity to sort of penetrate different worlds. Carroll was a little easier because Claremont's a college town. I mean, it's a town where you could easily have a liberal cop. You know, that's not a big stretch. But I think I wanted a neutral character, certainly not a right-wing cop type, to be sort of trying to solve this case. Because I think that mindset they wouldn't have gotten as far. So I think he was the key on that. And then the other characters, it was fun to just let them rip. I mean, whatever they wanted to say.
And you had the character Allie plays an important role in the mystery as well as in Jimmy's life personally. And they are very different from their viewpoints, their lifestyle, you know, what they're engaged in on a day-to-day basis. And they're two people that come together in this story, and they find ways most of the time to balance that out and respect each other's viewpoints, or at least, you know, put up that barrier of we're just going to disagree on that.
Yeah, well, I think there's no doubt that at least at the beginning, it's hormones triumphing over brains. I mean, they obviously were deeply attracted to each other, and that's how they got rolling. But again, Jimmy being able to listen to her without turning his brain off, again, was kind of an important component to solving the crime, for one thing. And Allie was challenging because it's essentially a 1972 book. I mean, that's when the work is being done by the detectives. But it's triggered by a 1970 incident, obviously the Kent State, the Nixon Cambodia, and then the fictional bombings. And Allie was there for that, so she was a witness. The other characters were there too, more peripheral, but she was deep into the radical movement that produced Richard Manning. So it was great to have her. There's one kind of long chapter where she sort of lays out everything that was going on back then. So she adds a lot to the party by being able to talk about that.
She did, and she was interesting because she is an important part for, like I said, for Jimmy and for the story, but she doesn't get a ton of page time. She kind of pops in here and there when she's needed in the story and plays her role, and then she kind of disappears here and there. And
right,
that
she
was
heads
an
to New
interesting
York.
approach with her. Yeah. And I thought that was really nicely done because it kept your focus on her importance when she would come back in, but she wasn't an overriding, you know, driving force behind them working through the case and figuring out what was going on.
And that actually changed a little bit from the initial conception. I was probably going to feature their romance more than I ended up doing. But then I realized, really, just as you said, it wasn't central to what the protagonist needed to accomplish. Plus, Jimmy and Allie are so fundamentally different that it's not like they were going to, either one was going to all of a sudden radically change their personalities or worldview and get married and live happily ever after. I mean, that just wasn't in the cards with those two. So I thought it was good to sort of move her off stage and then bring her back at certain key moments later on.
Yeah, I felt like that did work really well. And that's something throughout the storyline where you have a lot going on with the characters and their personal aspects and kind of some side ventures as they're working on this main mystery. How did you go about planning out the mystery? Was it as you went, you're figuring it out? Did you have everything outlined up to a certain point? Yeah, what was your process on this one?
Well, I think the first part of the writing, because this wasn't really their case, either Carol or Jimmy, and they were kind of moonlighting, is I think for a crime book, for a thriller, It's kind of leisurely, if you will, because what I was trying to do is build their characters more than anything else. And I wanted to show that, again, both Jimmy and Carol were very, very good at their jobs. And that was a big part of their both of their self-images, that they were really good at work. And I was able to build in some kind of fun scenes, the jailbreak and the crazy psychologist and these other side stories at the beginning to illustrate that, in my view, how good they were at what they did, as well as, setting the stage for the main story. And then at some point, I kind of flip a switch and say, all right, now let's roll. Let's get to the main event, if you will, and we kind of know who the characters are. Let's set up the confrontations. That first concentration time when Jimmy and Hitman Collins meet at that apartment in Claremont. That was important to me to sort of get it going then. And then from then on, I think it moves pretty traditionally in terms of time.
And that was another interesting thing with the pacing, is that it felt very realistic, actually, which I enjoyed. That in the beginning, it's a little bit over here, checking out this. Maybe that didn't pan out exactly the way they were hoping. And it took some time for them to gather enough evidence and support, really, because in the beginning, nobody's really helping them out. Nobody wants to hear about any of this. And then you do hit this point where things really start moving more quickly, and the various parts of this story wrap up individually, which was interesting, rather than everything coming together and wrapping up really nicely all in one moment. And that was something throughout this whole book with the characters, with the pacing, with the story, is just that level of realism that I think will really connect with readers and speak to them, that this was inspired by some real events, but it is fictional. But it definitely read like something that I could have seen this playing out in real life quite easily.
That's great. Again, I appreciate that. And at least I edge closer to the Four Corners when I get them to Las Vegas briefly. The road trips part of this were enjoyable. One person thought I should have kept everything closer to home, in Ontario and Cucamonga and all that sort of stuff. But I enjoyed actually it's both the Hitman and then Jimmy and Carol, to get them on the road. I always really enjoyed that in crime novels, and to be able to incorporate Las Vegas, Paso Robles, Atascadero, and then, of course, Portland, where I live now. And my daughter helped me with some location scouting while I was writing that.
I enjoyed the various locations and the work that it took to track everything down. I thought that went really well. And you leave the book open to this story continuing. So are you planning more books? Will this be a series, or will this remain a standalone?
Well, I joked to somebody recently that Jimmy and Carol were starting to throw stuff at me, saying, come on, we're here, we're formed, let's go. And I'm developing some ideas that would place it, and this is what stymied me for a while. The period 69 through about 74 is incredibly fertile in this country and in Southern California for just amazing things that were going on. And for a while, I was going to put any sequel after the epilogue, because the epilogue is 1974. But what I've decided, since people get to make their own rules, is that any sequel will be probably in the 73, 74 time period, just because I love that time period, and also because I was around then. So let's just say the Symbionese Liberation Army is something I'm researching right now. I don't know if that rings a bell.
Really interesting.
They had a night in Los Angeles, May of 74, that was kind of the beginnings, to some people say, of reality television, because everybody in LA had their television on, watching live while the police engaged in this just hellacious firefight with Symbionese Liberation Army, including the fact that people didn't know if Patricia Hearst was in there or not. Turns out she wasn't, but it was kind of a night that changed television in some ways. And that's an event that I like to bend fiction around reality. And that's something I'm focusing on right now.
Well, that sounds really interesting. So I'm excited to see what you do with it, and I'd definitely love to have you back.
Rosemary Zebark. She's a Santa Fe writer and good friend of my wife and me, and she's the one who got an invitation for me to Jeff at Artemisia. So I'm very grateful to Rosemary's assistance in this.
It's wonderful to have those connections in the community where you can find the right fit for your project. So the book is called Baseline Road, and it is by Orlando Davidson. And when is this releasing?
January 23, and I have a author's website. That's orlandodavidsonauthor.com. And Powell's Books, which we're very happy, that's sort of the holy grail and where I am now. And they have decided to also feature it if anyone wants to check it out.
Yeah, so please, listeners, head over, check out Orlando's website, and grab a copy. I really enjoyed it, and I hope the rest of the readers do too. I just wanted to thank you for taking the time to chat with me today and tell us more about your book and your writing process.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.
Did you enjoy that podcast? We hope that you did. And if you did, share it with your friends. And if you really want to keep podcasts like this coming, please support KSJE. You can do it easily online at ksje.com.